So I'm not really sure what sparked my interest in retro games. Probably due to me wanting to learn more about game design, prompting an interest in learning about its history, getting to try out games considered to be landmark titles or even masterpieces, as well as seeing some ideas that the industry has kind of left behind that honestly could be really interesting to see in a modern form. Or maybe it's just the fact that while growing up, I didn't really play a diverse range of games, mostly just sport titles and the occasional shoot 'em ups and racing games. Whatever might be the case, going through this retro phase allowed me to experience games like Chrono Trigger, Radiant Historia, Tekken 5, Persona 4, Majora's Mask, Earthbound, and Shadow of the Colossus, just to name a few. Games that I find really fascinating. So it was around that time, for some reason, I stumbled upon this game called Megaman Battle Network. Now I'm vaguely aware of the actual Mega Man series. I know it's a platformer and a sort of shooter, but I've never been really interested enough to pick one of them up and give it a try. But this one I found to be uniquely interesting, as it is a game that combines grid-based movements with real-time combats. Something to me at least seemed like oil and water, because whenever I think about anything related to grid-based movements, I will automatically think it's a turn-based game, given that it's a staple of the tactical turn-based RPG genre, and even one of the oldest games to ever exist, chess, plays exactly this way. But given that Mega Man Battle Network takes a real-time approach, the player has to put themselves in positions where they have to use their attacks or special abilities to deal damage while also trying to avoid being hit. Which works because each special ability has certain attributes that interact with the grid in really interesting ways. All in all, while I couldn't really get far in the game, I still found it to be a really interesting concept, and it made me really wonder why there weren't any games that were trying to replicate this in a modern form. But to my surprise, there were quite a number of them. Some of which that I later got to find out were the in development Hero.exe, which takes more of a roguelike approach to the genre, Endlanders, End Cycles, and easily my favorite of the bunch, One Step from Eden. I really like this one because a lot of games that borrowed ideas from Mega Man Battle Network tend to follow it very closely in terms of stuff like grid size, the way in which you get access to your special abilities, how the deck building works, and so on. But in One Step from Eden, there is a lot more space and a much more dynamic form of accessing your special attacks, resulting in a game that feels very fluid to move about in. And even though at the time I wasn't really a fan of roguelites due to stuff like how progression tends to work in those games, I did spend more time playing it than I expected, which prompted me to try making a prototype that was my own spin on the Mega Man Battle Network formula. Now, something I found to be a consistent source of game ideas for me is finding aspects of a game that I feel is either underutilized or could be implemented in a different way given my own preferences. And in this instance, one thing I was trying to go for with this prototype was to see if I could make a Mega Man style game centered around this shooting mechanic. Because while using special abilities is the primary form of dealing damage in these games, you also have the ability to shoot at enemies while waiting to get access to them, even though comparably it does far less damage. Now in games that follow Mega Man Battle Network closely, this mechanic feels more like shooting a pistol. But on the other hand, in One Step from Eden, it feels more like shooting an SMG, which to me felt a lot better. But seeing this mechanic in this light immediately reminded me of the shoot 'em up genre, particularly Cuphead, which is a game I really like, even though it has kicked my butt more times than I could count. So I was really interested in creating something with a similar feel. And this seemingly small distinction started to have pretty interesting ripple effects. For instance, in Mega Man Battle Network and games like it, to gain access to the special abilities within your deck, you will have to wait for this bar to fill up, and then the game freezes, you get dealt a number of cards to pick from, while also considering the cost in relation to the resource you have. Then you get back into the action with the chosen attacks in your arsenal. And while in One Step from Eden, it's a lot more free-flowing. At its core, you still have to wait for its own variation, which is called the mana bar, as it fills up automatically. And this system works fine in the context of the games in which it exists in, but while prototyping, I wanted a system much closer to what exists in Cuphead, where you actually have to hit the target to build up your special meter, which works pretty seamlessly. As for the special attacks themselves, I really wanted to do away with the deck building elements of the genre in favor of something much more streamlined. I took inspiration from the score streak system in COD, where each streak has its own amount required to activate it for use. But unlike how it's done in COD, I really wanted to tie each streak to a specific button on the controller, like how it's done in One Step from Eden. So to test this out, I settled upon 3 attacks. A boosted shot similar to this in Cuphead, a bomb that does AoE damage, and a dash slash similar to this in One Step from Eden. But while playtesting within the team, we all liked using the dash slash skill a lot. So much so that we decided to have it be a secondary attack that also builds up the SP meter, even though it has a considerable cooldown. And we replaced it with the ability to spawn in an obstacle to shield against certain attacks, which served as a nice contrast to the other skills given that it's a defensive ability. So with all the players' abilities implemented, the only thing left for me to figure out in this proof of concept was how enemy characters will work in relation to this gameplay change. So I worked on implementing a test enemy for that specific purpose. Generally in Megaman Battle Network style games, enemy characters, particularly bosses, exist in 2 states. A defensive or evasive state, where they move around their own grid in order to dodge a player's attacks or throw them off in general, and an attack state where they launch their own attacks at the player. And I thought that made a lot of sense, so I just went with it. For the evasive state, since the game exists within a grid, I took some cues from the different forms of movements in chess, like vertical, horizontal, diagonal, and this weird chess knight motion, which funny enough is just called an L-shaped motion. And for the attack states, I just made a bunch of attacks that seemed really interesting to implement, like this one, and this one, just to show a few. Honestly, since it was just a prototype, I wasn't really bothered with the details. I just wanted to see if the concept would work at all. And for the most part, I found it to be fun to play with, but something about it didn't feel right. What I was envisioning in my head was a somewhat fast and frantic experience, and while I implemented all the pieces I thought would get me to that point, I couldn't really reach that feeling. So I decided to take some time off to figure out why. And after a while, especially just playing games of a similar nature, what that made me realize was that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to reach that feeling I wanted in a way that was fun at least, with the player having to worry about one projectile at a time. Irrespective of the attack speed or distance, the player will still have room, or better said, the mental bandwidth to prepare for it, since that's the only thing they had to worry about. So essentially, that meant that the game needed to take some cues from the Bullethell subgenre. Now, I have a pretty love-hate relationship with most games in the genre. On one hand, I really love the idea of having to mentally manage the location and nature of multiple projectiles in my head within a short period of time, as I'm either forced to quickly plan ahead as to where I want to be in order to avoid damage, or frantically dodge out of a tight corner, both of which I find to be super fun. But some attack patterns are structured in a way that leaves so little room to dodge that requires you having to make small movements in order to maintain a space of safety, which I find to be quite tedious in a way that doesn't feel as fun. But given that the combat space the game will be taking place on is a 4x4 grid, it naturally avoids that aspect of the genre, so I thought it might be worth the try. So I took some of the enemy's attacks and made it act independently when they spawn, either by having them work on their own timers, existing long enough to remain in the player's working memory, or simply adding an extra enemy for the player to deal with. And with all that implemented, I was able to arrive at this. Honestly, one of the fun aspects of game development for me is when you see every little design element working together in cohesion towards the goal you've been thinking of in your head. It's hard for me to put in words, but it definitely makes it worth the effort. So when I was done with this, I gave it to some friends and family to try out. And while they ended up dying a bunch of times, I could see them wanting to keep on trying in order to overcome the challenge, which I felt to be a really good sign. That said, given that the game is one where the player is meant to react pretty accurately in tense scenarios, a good rule of thumb I learned was to reduce the hitbox of the projectiles, as humans aren't really equipped to react to quick motions perfectly all the time. Unless you're Daigo, I guess. So this helps makes the game feel fair, in the same vein as something like a coyote jump in platformers. So after I showed the rest of the team prototype, they were pretty stuck with the results, so we needed to plan how we wanted to go about developing it into an actual game, to see how much work it would take to complete it and what we need to prepare for ahead of time. There was one thing, no, actually, two things that I was pretty much set on going into the production phase of this game. The first was to keep the scope of this game really small. This was important given our long-term plans for the studio, part of which I mentioned in the previous video. Second was to make the entire game with prototype assets, using that to solely focus on the ideation of the content we want in the game, and after settling upon the ideas we want from start to finish, or at least close to finish, we then switch up all the assets we want in the final release. I got the idea to try this from watching GMTK's developing series, which covered the process of developing his game Mind Over Magnet. And I don't know why, but it just kinda clicked with me when I saw it. I mean, we're a design-first studio, in the sense that the gameplay informs most of the decisions we make while planning, rather than other stuff like narrative or visuals, for instance. And it also creates a pretty smooth pipeline from having the game being system and feature complete to it being content complete, resulting in a pretty much holistic view of the game. Which for me at least helps with stuff like properly tuning the difficulty curve through extensive testing, meaning that a lot of things are pretty much locked in by the time it's time to add the art and audio, which then smoothly transitions towards the polishing phase of the game. Though, having this mindset while also being inexperienced resulted in an oversight that honestly ended up costing us quite a bit, but I'll go over that a bit later in the video. But before then, a major decision we had to make was the game loop, and we decided to have the game be a boss rush. To us, it felt like it made the most sense, not just because the combat system was inspired by Cuphead, but given our push for a game idea with a small scope, it serves as a pretty streamlined loop, as the length is essentially determined by how many bosses the player will have to face over the course of the game. But with that came the decision on which order you will have to face these bosses. Originally, we were thinking of following in the footsteps of Fury, where you face these bosses one after the other, but in the end we decided to go with how it's done in Titan Souls, where you go from biome to biome, with each biome having a number of bosses you can take on in any order, but the player will have to take them all out to progress into the next biome. This does bring up the issue of balancing with relation with all the bosses within a world having to be of a similar difficulty level, which is definitely something to keep in mind. But honestly, I really like the idea of giving the player the ability to pick which challenge they want to tackle first, as well as the opportunity to try your hands on another boss if you're struggling with one. During the early playtest, one of the most prevalent requests we got during this period was to include more special abilities into the game. Initially, I was very much against this, as I wanted the game to be quite minimalist, similar to how it is in Titan Souls, where you have the same tools throughout the game and you have to work with it in order to overcome all the challenges the game throws at you. And I also felt that having new abilities will result in more time designing and implementing a system for it, as well as hunting for bugs and exploits. But after much convincing from the team and other game devs, I realized that giving the players some choice as to how they want to structure their playstyle through mixing and matching different special abilities is definitely very empowering. And personally, I do like features like that in games, so I thought, yeah, why not just put it in? And as an added bonus, it kind of ties back to the deck building elements within the genre's DNA. Finally, in terms of content, we decided that the game will ship in its base version with 12 bosses spread across 4 worlds. Now, this decision was made looking at the resources we currently have, so given the fact that we're actively working towards funding, this number could change, or could simply just be added in a DLC of some sort, though no promises. That said, the bosses were chosen from a number of ideas and themes that seemed really interesting to play around with, some of which includes the theme of a king, swordsman, librarian, collector, just to name a few. Now, all these are just development names and some of them have been modified to fit the intended flow of the boss fights, but we thought that was a good starting point nonetheless. Setting up the level system with all its basic functionality was a pretty straightforward process, given the template I had to work with. The only real decisions I had to make were the distribution of boss fights in each biome, and that the player will also have to use grid-based movement outside of battle as opposed to freeform movement. I decided to go with this as I felt that it will help the player get accustomed to moving this way, so it's a much smoother experience in battle. Setting up the special ability system took very little time to do, which I found kind of surprising. So, in the overworld, you can freely swap between different abilities you've acquired in the skill menu. Though right now you have access to all the skills in the game at once, which of course isn't going to be the case in the full release. I haven't just figured out the best way for players to get new special abilities yet. I have some ideas on how to go about it, but I'm really interested in seeing your suggestions in the comments. That said, I've also made a sort of tutorial for the player. I chose to have it in a way that avoids handholding through the use of tutorial text showing how things work, rather electing to have the player figure out what they can do and sort of experiment with the toolset they have, which I think tends to stick more than just having the player read a bunch of stuff. That said, during playtesting, the reception of this has been pretty mixed, so I wanted to get more feedback on it before making any final changes. And with all that implemented into a functional state, it essentially was down to the grind of making new bosses. And to give an idea of how we approach concepts in a boss, I'll go over the design of one of the bosses in the game. So the first thing we do for every boss in the game is to settle on a theme for that boss, which will help us steer some of the ideas for possible attacks that the boss will perform and their general antics. For this boss, I wanted one that was quite nimble and aggressive, like a swordsman. One that will sort of contrast a lot of the bosses the player would have seen up to that point that launches attacks from their own divide of the grid. This boss will be able to invade the player's grid to attack directly, so we thought of attacks that will fit with this fantasy. The ones we ended up with were a dash attack, a spin attack, an attack from behind, and a slash projectile, just to give it some form of range ability as well. And after that, it was just simply tuning the frequency in which these attacks come out, how fast they go in and out of the attack states to the evasive states, and other little touches that will help the boss feel interesting to go up against. And for the rest of the bosses in the game, we just used a similar approach as well, just with each one having their own different patterns that fits into our own idea for that particular boss, which of course scales up in difficulty as you progress through the game. All in all, at this point I've implemented all 12 bosses with their final attack patterns, though the bosses of the last world need more work as they are right now very difficult to deal with. But in due time I plan to fine tune it to a point that feels fair. That said, there's enough finalized content to proceed with implementing art and audio into the game, and possibly pushing towards securing funding. And that last bit serves as a nice segue to explain where the aforementioned oversight came in. Now, while I firmly stand with the decision to have the full game be playable with just prototype assets, the mistake we made was going straight into full production instead of making a vertical slice first, which came back to bite us in two forms. First being in terms of funding and early marketing. While we know the vision we have for the game in its entirety, it's hard to convince people to buy into an idea when it looks like, well, this. And while we're aiming for some sort of prototype funding and we did apply for a few, in hindsight we would have probably had a better chance if there were other things to draw people's interest like arts and sound, and also considering that the game idea is quite niche. And it also lets people know about the game early, which always helps in terms of securing wishlists. At least that would be the case if we could even create a Steam page for the game. Okay, so this portion of the video was supposed to be me kind of ranting about how difficult it is to get a Steam page from the country where I'm in, but after seeing a lot of people go through the same process and getting it right, it made me realize that maybe as a fledgling industry, we kind of didn't really get the way it was supposed to go. Again, I'm still kind of learning how this thing goes, and I don't want to say something that could probably cause an issue down the line. So the only thing I can really say is that's basically been fixed, essentially. Okay, back to the video. And honestly, why I try and pit this as just a rookie mistake on our end, I'll be lying if I said that it's something I simply shrugged off, as it puts us in quite a tight spot regarding planning for the release of the game, so it's a bit hard not to kick yourself for that misstep. Alas, as a mantra I try to live by, which is you live, you learn, so going forward, that would definitely be something we will know to plan ahead for. With all that said, that's pretty much all the work done that I can talk about right now. We're currently in the process of implementing art and audio into the game, and my god, That process led to another set of lessons we had to learn. So I intend to go over all that in a future video, but it looks pretty good so far. There's a link below to a set of prototype demos that you can try, be it the proof of concept boss fight as well as a few bosses in the main game. Links to that will be in the description, as well as our Discord server where you can share your thoughts on the project or generally just hang out. I'll be honest, I haven't been as active as I wanted to over there, but once I settle a lot of the stuff that I have to take care of in my personal life, I should be more active over there. Okay, before I go, I want to conclude with this video's indie game highlights. Flooded Burials. It is a top-down action-adventure game where you make use of a parry-focused combat system to tackle various enemies and bosses as you venture through a flooded tower, hence the name. One thing I find really engaging about this game, aside from the aforementioned combat system, is how much speedrunning is encouraged through its level design, fluid movements, and enemy placements, which leads to that really satisfying itch to go back to a level aiming for a faster time. In case you think the art style looks familiar, that's because it was made by the same developer as Rusted Moss, which is a game I highly recommend you try as well. The game is available for wishlist on both Steam and itch.io, and as at the time of recording has a playable demo that you can try out. And of course, the links to that will be in the description. Anyways, thanks for your time and I'll see you in the next one.